Well, hello there. Fancy meeting you.
Hello, good morning, Tony Wilkinson. Thank you for appearing on Meet the Archaeologist. First of all, can you just confirm your position here in the university, how it is that you got into archaeology, and also what it is that you're up to at the moment?
Well, I'm Tony Wilkinson. I'm a professor of archaeology here in Durham University, and I got into archaeology through a fairly circuitous route. I was originally trained as a geographer in London, and then subsequently at McMaster University in Canada, in Ontario. And when I was in Canada, my research involved what they call runoff hydrology in the Canadian high Arctic, and that of basically that was watching the snow melt. Snow melts, creates big floods, and we were monitoring these, measuring them, and communicating the results. This is actually, that was fairly prescient work, given all of the work and challenges that are going on nowadays regarding ice melt and the melting of the polar ice caps associated with global warming. From there, I moved into Middle Eastern archaeology, although I was also working at the same time in Britain. So I was working in the summer in Britain and then working in the winter in fun places like the Persian Gulf, Oman, and Syria. And when I was working in the field, there wasn't really much of a concept of landscape archaeology in the Middle East. It had traditionally been dominated by either excavations or by art history and art historical process and artifactual approaches. So I started wandering around away from sites, and actually people gave me a job to do that, and they boasted of the fact that, oh, we've got a geomorphologist working for us. Do you? And of course people were saying, no, what the hell's a geomorphologist? So I became a minor status symbol, even though people didn't quite understand what I was producing. But gradually, by publishing, I did start to create a field of awareness, let's say that. So this built up. This was obviously the initial work was right at the end of the 1960s and in the 1970s. And it was during that period that I started to develop an idea of how landscape archaeology in the Middle East can be structured, what sorts of things we should be looking for. So it became really, really exciting. So that work has developed obviously over the subsequent years until I arrived in Durham here via University of Chicago, British School in Iraq, and also Edinburgh University. And this has led up to, say, a couple of projects that I'm doing at the moment. One, which is just coming to a close, is a really exciting one where we're looking at the Fertile Crescent. It's called the Fragile Crescent project. And we're looking at changes in settlement over a huge area. We're using satellite images to recognize the sites, to what we call re-interrogate the original surveys, and to look at settlement change over this huge area between the 4th and 3rd millennium BC. You might be asking, well, so what? Does it matter? And one of the things that has come out of this is an extraordinary degree of dynamics of the development of cities. They're not, we tend to see archaeological sites as blobs, and a blob that you just dig. But in fact, some of these sites were what we call sort of big, slow developing hubs. And these were what were fairly current in the 4th millennium BC. And then in the 3rd millennium BC, this is sort of contemporary with the Akkadian Empire in southern Mesopotamia, we see relatively small tell-based settlements explode in size up to about 100, 120 hectares in many cases, and then collapse again. So when you're looking at civilizational collapse, you have to appreciate that often this is simply a specific form of city that's experiencing a boom and bust cycle, growing and then decreasing. You look at the smaller sites, where probably most of the people lived, and they remained stable through long periods of time. So this is telling us something about sustainability of the world, well, let's say of the Middle East. And particularly interesting, we're finding that whereas in the 4th millennium BC, which was the first real phase of urbanization, you're seeing early cities, if you want to call them cities, and this is something we argue about, you know. The early
cathedral.
Yeah. Well, they did have temples.
Yeah, exactly.
And they did have public buildings. But so we have these earlier settlements were in the moisture areas and the stable areas where you can get guaranteed crops. However, in the 3rd millennium BC, these sites, these boom and bust sites especially, they expanded down into the drier areas. And one of the models we have is that the reason that they could expand down into these areas is not because it was wetter or anything like that, but simply because they were participating in this huge industry of sheep rearing, which contributed to the growth of the textile industry. And you might say, well, is this all theoretical? You know, is this just ideas? But in fact, we've got the evidence of the spread on the ground and from satellite imagery. And new sites are coming up at the moment from the satellite images. We are finding them, not as we speak, but certainly a few days ago, we're finding new sites. And these are huge, huge developments that we can explain from the context of climate and water resources and things like that. But the other side of the equation about the sheep rearing, part of that comes from environmental archaeology, studying the bones, but also we've got a huge range of cuneiform texts that actually describe the textile industries, not only in southern Mesopotamia, but also in cities like Ebla. And they do detail not only that there was textile production going along, but they also describe the textile workers, the women, the children, and the other labour who were working in these, I'll call it textile industry. I hesitate to call them factories. So you've got two sides of the equation, and we're just bringing these together to see how this the context, the economic context of the world in the 3rd millennium resulted in what was basically high-risk behaviour. They could take risks because there was a lot to be made. I'm not using the word profit because that's a modernist concept, and so I'm dodging around this to be politically correct and also to be a little bit more appropriate. So we're not talking about profit making, but we are talking about people tapping in to a seam of economics that was very productive at the time and under those circumstances. After that, things seemed to fade somewhat, and those boom and bust cities collapsed.
So this sense of urbanism developing, the sense of risk-taking behaviour. You said that you don't want to compare it in terms of the vernacular to modern or modernism and capitalism, this kind of thing. But do you think there are any lessons which the modern Western world, could take from some of these boom and bust behaviours?
Yes, but it would be very easy to be preachy and say boom and bust behaviours are not a good thing, avoid them. But when you're in the process, and when you've got to realise that these cities that were boom and bust and didn't survive for very long were around for 100, 200, 300, sometimes 400 years, which is actually fairly successful as things go. But they're boom and bust compared to what went before. That's the perspective that we're getting. And whenever I sagely come to people with advice, such as, the George Bush government not invading Iraq, you're ignored anyway. And so I tend not to be that preachy about things. But on the other hand, one does get a very informed perspective on the way the world works. And I only wish more people would look at these aspects a little bit more analytically.
Okay, excellent. Okay. So with this in mind, then you touched a little bit on being at the very least having some form of interaction with governmental decision, even if you're ignored, that decision-making process. Does this feed into what you have found satisfying about being an archaeologist? I'm thinking in particular your work with, for example, the US Army. I remember you talking about that certainly when I was here at this university. That is. Have you found that particularly satisfying, or are there other elements of your work which you think have also you go home and you think, yes, that was good, that meant something?
Well, I think if you're involved, then you can do something.
Mm-hmm.
There is a debate over, for example, the war with Iraq.
Mm-hmm.
That was a very hotly debated topic. Do you get involved with, for example, the US military and therefore become part of the problem? Or do you step aside
mm-hmm.
and agitate from the sidelines where nobody's listening to you?
Mm.
And a group of us from the University of Chicago, which is where I was in 2003.
And I believe Indiana Jones is alma mater, I think.
Well, we
that's
won't.
where he went. Supposedly.
Yes, actually, yes, because it was all built around the Robert Braidwood figure.
Mm-hmm,
That's true.
mm-hmm,
Yeah. So a group of us decided that really the only way to deal with these types of problems are to be pragmatic and to engage. And there are risks.
Mm-hmm.
And there was a group of us from University of Chicago, Michigan, Stony Brook University, and we went with the National Geographic Society. They are one of those organizations that when you have a war,
mm-hmm.
they can be up and running and into the field extraordinarily quickly. And so they managed to get us, well, we were in touch with them,
mm-hmm.
and together we were in Iraq in early May
mm-hmm.
2003, and the war had finished in April. And we did a quick mission. We split into two. One part went to the south and looking at site damage in southern Mesopotamia, southern Iraq, and the other group, we went to the north
mm-hmm.
and looking at site damage. And you do learn a lot from this sort of visit, because in fact, most of the destruction that happens to cultural sites, cultural heritage, and archaeology comes not from what I call the ballistic effect
mm-hmm.
of war, tanks shooting at sites and things like that. It comes from the removal of the administrative umbrella.
Mm.
And of course this was Saddam Hussein's Iraq, and Saddam Hussein had a very strong umbrella.
Mm-hmm.
And therefore, in fact, certainly in the 80s when I worked there, I didn't work in Iraq in the 90s, but certainly
mm-hmm.
in the 1980s, there was a very, very strong control on archaeological sites. The local representatives monitored the sites, and they monitored any potential damage. And even between you and me and the listeners, there was it was understood that in the late 80s, diplomats weren't allowed to go on archaeological sites because they had been accused by the Iraqi government
mm-hmm.
of being involved in the, let's say, the transfer of antiquities out of Iraq.
Right.
I can't verify the veracity of that,
mm-hmm.
but basically, there was a strong control
mm-hmm.
on the archaeology, and that dwindled during the 1990s and disappeared, of course, in 2003 with the invasion of Iraq. And that's when you see huge amounts of looting going on,
mm-hmm.
and the destruction of sites that will never be understandable in a complete comprehensive way, again, because the stratigraphy has been destroyed, the artifacts have gone, and many of the most important objects associated with the stratified context have all been dispersed onto the international art market.
So how did you communicate that then to those who were assigned in the aftermath of the most recent Iraq conflict? How did you communicate the importance of these sites to the people who were assigned to protect those sites?
After the destruction of the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, there was a perspective that the occupying powers were not really safeguarding the heritage as they should have been. So it became a blame game. And the blame game, of course, polarizes into, let's call it right and left. The liberal group saying, well, the army should have done more to protect the monuments and especially the museums, whereas the other group, let's call them the right wing, it's too simplistic to make these subdivisions, but the other groups were saying, well, our army have a tough job invading a country, and it's very, very uncertain to work, and we should be behind them in doing whatever they want to do, and the museums are of secondary importance. And so that means that by being an archaeologist that is concerned about the archaeology and the cultural heritage, it means that by default you end up being seen as not on the side of the US Army, which is not true, because we had a lot of liaison with them. We were treated very well, and we talked to them, and we had a very, very good set of relationships, and we were able to move forward the protection of archaeological sites and move it up the agenda. But the public perspective, say on some talk radio programs, I did a lot of TV interviews, and I remember being on a radio interview where I was basically ambushed and told, well, that I wasn't being patriotic because I was supporting archaeology. Whereas when you're in the field and when you're working with the soldiers and you're talking to the soldiers, ironically, the world is not as polarized as that.
No.
And you have a pragmatic working relationship. You get on with the individuals, and you get on with the job in hand, and you appreciate their problems, and they appreciate what you're doing. And there was an interesting case in where I actually did a televised view of Nimrud, this Assyrian capital in northern Iraq. And some of the soldiers there who had just been billeted there to protect the site, and the Iraqi authorities wanted them there, and that's the interesting thing. The Iraqi authorities wanted them there to protect the site, but the soldiers didn't know anything about the site, its significance. They didn't even know it was an archaeological site. Well, they knew it was an archaeological site. They had no idea what it was. And, I had to explain to them this was the nerve center of the Assyrian Empire in the 9th century BC. And communicating that made their work more meaningful. And they could understand. They said, I wish somebody had told us that, because this is really, I understand now, this is hugely important. Some of the soldiers obviously were more aware, but when you're just parachuted onto a site in a country that you've never been to, in a language that you don't know, of course there's going to be huge areas of let's say, lack of knowledge. So in fact you're filling in some of the gaps, and you're making their work more meaningful. And as I emphasize, it was work that the Iraqi government, that of course had just failed, but the Department of Antiquities staff continued to work, even with bombs falling, even with museums being hit and things like that. They continued to work, and they invited the American army in. So when you're in the field in these sorts of circumstances, you see a much, much more nuanced world and a much more complex world than the world of talk radio.
Absolutely, yeah, and I suppose combating that very easy sense of flag waving, and also I imagine though being able to in some ways reassure those guys who were doing the protection work that they may not be on the front line, but they're certainly on a front line. And when it comes to looting and particularly places like absolutely necessary. Okay, well. We've talked a little bit about or rather we've touched on those challenges of looting. So I won't necessarily ask you explicitly to repeat all that stuff again by asking you about the challenges for archaeology. But what I will ask is, in your opinion, with your perspective and the scope of archaeology that you've experienced in the places where you've worked, what, if there was anything, what advice would you give to archaeologists or rather people who wanted to get into archaeology, young or old, or even students who are currently studying archaeology? What advice would you give to those people?
Well, I think this sounds like propaganda, so edit this out. But archaeology gives you a wide range of skills. And, for example, I'm involved, the great project that I'm involved, the Fragile Crescent project at the moment, but also this European community funded Persia project, which is looking at the frontiers of the Sasanian Empire. Both of these are using satellite remote sensing. Satellite remote sensing is obviously a very, very current skill, extraordinarily valuable, and it's extremely useful for archaeology. I'm not going to boast, but one of my former students is now working in military intelligence, not in this country, but in another country.
Okay.
And so I once met a radiologist in London. I was talking to her before they put me on the slab, and she was a graduate from Durham University, and she knew my colleagues here. She'd graduated early 90s, late 80s, something like that. And she'd trained up as a radiologist, and now she's saving lives in London.
And this was following on from an archaeology degree, was it?
Yes.
Oh wow. Okay.
This is she did archaeological science, and she knew Chris Capel, Ian Bailiff, my colleagues here, and it was very interesting that you've already got medical profession spooks with real hands-on skills. And the people in archaeology are coming with hands-on skills and knowledge of the field. They're not being totally retrained. Obviously, as a radiologist, you have to be retrained. You don't go in with your trowel and you start being. But the main message is there's a very, very wide range of work that you can move into with your archaeological skills, as well as, of course, as archaeology. I mean, one of my main concerns, obviously, at the moment, at a broad and ethical level, is the loss of archaeological heritage. I mean, I can't remember whether it was in the class that I gave when you were here, but I saw it as being, you are the last generation. In other words, you're the last generation to see the world as it is. There are fantastic sites left. There's a lot of archaeology left, but that entire landscape has been transformed completely, and we can see this from Google Earth, and we can see it from comparing Google Earth and the images contained within Google Earth with those of the satellite images that were taken as parts of the spy program by the CIA and the Corona program in the 1960s and early 1970s, which coincidentally was when I was first working in the area. And I keep looking at these images to see if I can see myself, but I haven't seen myself yet. But the main thing is, this time perspective of 40 odd years reminds me every day that we are losing so much of the archaeology in the Middle East and many other parts of the old world. And of course, this is only compounded by the losses of administrative control that are happening in countries like Syria, where at the moment it's a free-for-all in the country. It's extraordinarily difficult for the Department of Antiquities to function. They are still functioning, but under appallingly difficult circumstances. Meanwhile, sites are being plundered. We can only monitor it from a distance and keep in touch with our colleagues in Syria. But so there is a big ethical problem confronting us. How do we protect and record the archaeology over these huge areas for future generations, or at least safeguard it to such a degree by recording it so that people will know what's been lost? And if we hadn't been doing this type of work, I would say that in fact most of the archaeological areas that I have been working on in the Middle East have now been destroyed partially or totally, or submerged under lakes for hydroelectric power. So there's for future generations, there's a huge challenge to try to get involved in recording and safeguarding, working with the appropriate authorities to safeguard the antiquities and the cultural heritage throughout the old world, and I'm focusing here on the Old World, but specifically, obviously, the Middle East from my own perspective.
Okay, excellent. Well, with that big thought in mind, I'd like to say thank you very much for your time, and well, hopefully we'll speak again. Thank you.
Yes. Well, thank you very much for inviting me into this splendid office with these rather impressive books behind. I'd just like to point out the Persia imperial power in late antiquities. This is the Gorgan Wall project that I was talking about earlier. I didn't really go into any detail, so I'll have to read the 15 kilos of book to try to sort that out. You can edit that one out.
Not at all. Thank you.